Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirk and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 6 wide receiver rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be mentioning my top 40 wide receiver rankings as I'll talk about each of them individually, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions while also presenting statistics that justify their current rankings as we approach Week 6. I'm also going to be talking about matchups at the wide receiver position in regards to what defenses have been allowing the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average in order to identify the most advantageous matchups going into the given week. Again, there's a lot of wide receivers to talk about, so before we get into it, a reminder, there are timestamps down in the description of the video if you're looking for a specific wide receiver. Also, while you're down in the description of the video, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season with the singular purpose of trying to help you guys win a fantasy football championship. We are very close to achieving our goal of 80,000 subscribers, so if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe and of course support. Thank you very much. All right, let's begin by talking about matchups at the wide receiver position, beginning with the fact that the Los Angeles Chargers, despite the fact that they are coming off of a bye along with the Seattle Seahawks, they are still giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format in terms of wide receiver isolated receiving statistics, which only contains receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Of course, we want to take advantage of these matchups. Hopefully, CeeDee Lamb could have himself a bounce back game here against the Los Angeles Chargers secondary, who no longer have JC Jackson as one of their primary secondary members. So going into the given week, there is an expectation for CeeDee Lamb to have himself a high upside performance, hopefully, if Dak Prescott could, of course, just play a little bit better on a weekly basis. Now, the Seattle Seahawks, they have dealt with their fair share of injuries. Nonetheless, we have Ja'Marr Chase going into town, the guy that is always open and obviously demonstrated that this last week. That's going to be a great matchup for him. The Washington Commanders, of course, besides the fact that every wide receiver is dominated against them thus far this season, we also saw most recently DJ Moore go for over 40 overall fantasy points, had himself a fantastic game, 3 touchdowns, over 230 receiving yards, a boatload of catches by himself as the only receiver in that offense to even catch a ball on Thursday Night Football in the matchup. Nonetheless, another advantageous matchup. Hopefully, someone like Drake London could have himself a high upside performance. Nonetheless, those are the most advantageous matchups in the given week. Now, when we go into the other end of the conversation and we talk about defenses that don't allow very many points to opposing wide receivers, we're talking about the Cleveland Browns, the Dallas Cowboys, the New York Jets. Again, when we're talking about top-tier cornerbacks like a Denzel Ward, Stephon Gilmore, Sauce Gardner, that certainly plays a difference in terms of the overall potential upside of our fantasy prospects. So we have to keep that in mind when we are, blindly starting some of these players. Of course, a majority of our rosters, we have guys that are set it and forget it overall all-stars, but there are also players that are on that kind of fence as to whether or not we are going to start them, and oftentimes matchups can definitely be the determining factor as to whether or not we have enough confidence to start them in the given week. Now, with this all presented, we'll go ahead and refer back to these statistics over the course of today's episode on each individual wide receiver basis if I find it to be relevant, but outside of that, let's get into our top 40 wide receiver rankings. For those of you guys who are trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings, even up until Sunday morning, be sure to go ahead, travel down to the description of the video and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be eligible for a first-time deposit match up to $500, which again is a limited time offer that is ending soon, so be able to take advantage of that immediately. You're also going to get my ranking sent to you from my email directly to yours every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season from week 6 through 18. These rankings are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, top 120 flex, content that is not available on this channel, available to you every single Sunday morning. All you got to do, sign up using code Andrew, make a first-time deposit minimum of $10. Now, for those of you who are wondering if you're eligible for the opportunity on hand of helping me help you, check out the map to the right side of the screen, draft responsibly, and be sure to put together some pick'em slips. We've been on fire as of late, and we're going to continue that trend going into Thursday Night Football. Tomorrow, there is a special offer for those of you who are new to signing up and making that first-time deposit. You'll be able to put together a pick'em slip with Patrick Mahomes, 0.5 total yards, and go ahead and start off your underdog journey with a W via the pick'em slip. So be sure to check that out today. Thank you very much for the support. All right, let's start by talking about the wide receiver position with our number one. Of course, it's Tyreek Hill. Unfortunately, Justin Jefferson isn't going to be a part of this conversation for many of weeks because he is on the injured reserve, but Tyreek Hill is a suitable replacement as the number one at the position. He's coming off of a week in which he had 9 targets, 8 catches, 181 and a receiving touchdown. But going into the matchup on the given week against the Carolina Panthers, on paper, it's an advantageous matchup, primarily because we've seen other wide receivers like Justin Jefferson, 85 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. Most recently, Josh Reynolds, 76 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown. DK Metcalf, 6 catches, 112. We have seen great performances, but this is all while J.C. Horn has been on the injury reserve. He is returning this week from his hamstring injury, and there is an anticipation that he will probably be covering Tyreek Hill. Luckily for all of us, no one can cover Tyreek Hill. It's going to take 3 defenders to be able to bottle him up in the given week. As long as he continues to see these high overall upside of opportunity in terms of targets, the expectation is incredibly high upside. As you can see from the next gen stats chart on the bottom of the screen, the plays that he is making, whether they're 50 yards down the field or in the backfield, he always has the ability of catching the ball and taking it to the house, as he typically does. Moving on to our number 2, we have Ja'Marr Chase, and like he mentioned a couple weeks back, he's always effing open, and he demonstrated that against the Arizona Cardinals in spades. I mean, the fact of the matter is he set a career high in terms of targets with 19 and receptions with 15. Had himself 192 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, and this is the healthiest that Joe Burrow has ever looked. And thanks to the absence of T. Higgins, there was even more of an emphasis to get the ball in the direction of Ja'Marr Chase. Obviously, T. Higgins was dealing with a rib fracture, but we have seen throughout his entire career, any time in which T. Higgins has not been in the game, Ja'Marr Chase always has these big upside performances. Now, in terms of the chart that you guys can see to the bottom of the screen, very seldom do we ever see Ja'Marr Chase, running deep routes. Everything is still close to the line of scrimmage, enough to where Joe Burrow is comfortable getting the ball out of his hands quickly, based on the fact that he is still dealing with this calf injury and the fact that this offensive line isn't the greatest. Therefore, we're still going to see, this lack of overall upside in terms of his deep receiving threat, but as we continue throughout the weeks, hopefully Joe Burrow's health will continue, the offensive line will play better, and Ja'Marr Chase will have even more upside over the top of opposing defenses. Moving on to our number 3, we have Stefon Diggs, coming off of another great performance of 20-plus fantasy points at the end of the game, had a fumble. I'm sure somebody in the entire fantasy football landscape lost because of that singular fumble within the given week off that lateral. Now, regardless of that, Stefon Diggs has just been amazing this season. In 4 out of the last 5 games, 100 or more receiving yards. Again, very few receivers have been able to accomplish that thus far this season, yet Stefon Diggs is doing it consistently. Another game in which he had double-digit targets. This is all while on the opposite side of the field, Gabriel Davis is going for 100 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown against the Jacksonville Jaguars. This upcoming week, they do take on the New York Giants. They have an inexperienced secondary, and the fact that the Bills are coming off of a loss, there is an expectation against a team that is dealing with a lot of injuries on the offensive side of the ball. They're going to have a lot of 3-and-out scenarios. There is an expectation that the Buffalo Bills are going to pour it on. And when they do, my only worry is if this game becomes a blowout and Stefon Diggs doesn't get his early enough in the game in the first 3 quarters, he's probably going to be sitting on the bench in the 4th quarter along with Josh Allen, as they'll have blown out this New York Giants team by the time that they get there. Hopefully it'll be a little bit of a closer matchup, but that's my only concern. Outside of that, I'm expecting a huge performance out of Stefon Diggs. Moving on to our number 4, we have Cooper Kupp. Again, like I mentioned last week, Cooper Kupp's back healthy, and because of the fact that we heard Sean McVay say last week that there's no limitations on Cooper Kupp, that was the expectation. That's exactly what we immediately saw against the Philadelphia Eagles. On the first drive of the game against the Philadelphia Eagles, Matthew Stafford had 10 passing attempts in that drive. 6 of those passing attempts were sent in the direction of Cooper Kupp, which led to 5 receptions and 56 receiving yards. He ended the game with 8 catches for 118 receiving yards, and as a whole, this is the Cooper Kupp that we know and love, all while Puka Nacua was able to thrive within the offense as well, which is fantastic to see. So Cooper Kupp, the expectation going up against the Arizona Cardinals, of course, is another one of these high upside overall performances. Most recently, Ja'Marr Chase, again, 15 catches, 192, 3 touchdowns. Brandon Aiyuk, 6 catches for 148. So why not Cooper Kupp having himself another upside performance? In the last 30 games that he has participated in which he's been healthy, including the NFL playoffs, he has had 25 of those performances of 15 or more fantasy points. He's probably going to have himself another big game here in week 6. Number 5 is A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. Again, A.J. Brown, since having that temper tantrum on the sideline week 2 against the Minnesota Vikings, he has been unstoppable in the last 3 games, seeing himself 3 consecutive weeks of over 100 receiving yards. Very seldom do we see that, yet he obviously wanted the ball, he's asked for it, and he's continued to get it every single week. And we have seen other receiving options within this offense disappear, like a DeVonta Smith last week. In weeks prior, it was Dallas Goedert disappearing. But A.J. Brown has been the constant as of late. In the last 3 games, he is garnering a 31.25% target share, which is incredible. And going forward, specifically in the matchup against the New York Jets, we're anticipating another upside performance. Number 1 wide receivers that we've recently seen take on the New York Jets, like a Stefon Diggs, 10 catches, 102 and a touchdown. CeeDee Lamb, 11 catches, 143. There is upside in the given matchup, despite the fact that the secondary has played very well this season. we're not anticipating someone like Sauce Gardner to trail or, potentially follow A.J. Brown, because that's not how their defense works, as they're primarily playing zone. Let's move on to the A tier. We have our number 6, Davante Adams. Now, even though Davante Adams was quite underwhelming in the overall performance against his former team, and there was a higher expectation for him to get far more targets, the fact of the matter was he was coming off of a little bit of an injury during the course of the week, the shoulder injury that he sustained in the week prior against the Los Angeles Chargers, and he, of course, kind of battled through that. Nonetheless, going up against the New England Patriots should be an exciting game here. Of course, it's a Jimmy Garoppolo revenge game of sorts, but not only that, the fact of the matter is the defensive backs of the New England Patriots are all injured. Besides the fact that, Jonathan Jones, Jack Jones, Marcus Jones, Christian Gonzalez just got recently put on the injured reserve. These guys are all injured. They did bring back J.C. Jackson, but we have seen in seasons past, specifically last year, week 1, Davante Adams taking on J.C. Jackson. He torched him, had 10 receptions, 141 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown against the Los Angeles Chargers in that given week. There is an expectation for Davante Adams to get back on track, get healthy, and have himself an upside week, as Jimmy Garoppolo is obviously trying to pour it on against his former team. Our number 7 is Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley, again, has a fantastic matchup. Besides the fact that he had himself an upside performance against the Buffalo Bills, obviously without Tre'Davious White, it's going to be difficult to bottle up someone like Calvin Ridley. But this upcoming week, taking on the Indianapolis Colts, we've already seen him dominate against this team already this season. Week 1, in that contest, 11 targets, 8 catches, 101 and a touchdown, 20.1 fantasy points. Could have had himself a second receiving touchdown if he didn't step out of bounds on the 15-yard line in that overall game. The expectation going up against the 9th easiest matchup at the position, the Indianapolis Colts secondary that has been picked on by all teams. I mean, DeAndre Hopkins at his age, 8 catches for 140 last week. Puka Nacua, 9 catches, 163 and a touchdown. Even guys like Nico Collins, 4 catches, 146 and a touchdown. Calvin Ridley, a fantastic automatic play in the given week. Number 8 is Keenan Allen. Even though they're coming off of a bye week, I think that is an actual benefit for their team. They're going to be healthy, and going into the matchup against the Dallas Cowboys, they will have prepared for this team. Obviously, the coaches will have done their due diligence, preparing for a matchup in which they obviously want to go ahead and capture another victory. But going up against the Dallas Cowboys, it is an easier matchup for a guy like Keenan Allen in comparison to someone that is going to play on the outside like Joshua Palmer within this offense, primarily because the Dallas Cowboys this season, they're playing man coverage more than any other team in the National Football League. That's 42% of their overall defensive snaps, man coverage. With that being the case, amongst all receiving options in the National Football League, Keenan Allen has the most receptions against man coverage. There is an expectation that in the slot position, no one can cover such a great route runner like Keenan Allen. I'm anticipating another high upside performance, and with Eckler coming back, obviously this offense is going to be healthy because of the bye week. There is an expectation that this offense takes another step forward and ends up putting even more points on the board. Number 9 is Puka Nacua. Again, like I mentioned prior to this last week, we are without a doubt going to see a coexistence between these two receiving options, primarily because I compared them to Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods back in 2021. And like I mentioned on this last weekend's live streams, when we look at Robert Woods back in 2021, weeks 1 through 9. Robert Woods, prior to the injury, was averaging 12.74 half PPR fantasy points per game and was the number 11 overall wide receiver throughout that span of time. We know that Matthew Stafford can support multiple top-tier wide receivers. We have seen him be able to distribute the ball, and as long as they can keep him upright and healthy, of course, the sky's the limit. They take on the Arizona Cardinals. It is an advantageous matchup, like I mentioned earlier with Cooper Kupp, as we've seen guys like Jamar Chase go off recently, and even guys like Brandon Aiyuk. The expectation going into the given week, probably another week in which he has double-digit targets and finds himself even more fantasy upside. That's my expectation. Number 10 is CeeDee Lamb. Now, even though CeeDee Lamb has been very quiet this season, oftentimes it has to do with the fact that they're either blowing out teams or getting blown out. Of course, in week 1 against the New York Giants, they were blowing out that team. The defense scored a lot of touchdowns. And even against the New England Patriots, same thing happened. And in those overall performances, we didn't see much out of CeeDee Lamb. But in the rest of the games, we've only seen him really play well against, honestly, the New York Jets. Against the Arizona Cardinals was quite underwhelming. And this last week against the 49ers, quite underwhelming. In 4 out of the last 5 games that CeeDee Lamb has played this year, he has had less than 8 targets. That is not a great number to see, especially considering the fact that he's number 25 amongst all receiving options in terms of total targets this year. And when you go back to last season, there was a high volume of games in which you saw, double-digit targets consistently with Dak Prescott. They got to get back to those days, and luckily they have the easiest matchup at the position, taking on the Los Angeles Chargers secondary, which are allowing nearly 40 fantasy points per game in a half PPR to opposing wide receivers. And as the de facto number 1 of this offense, CeeDee Lamb is expected to have himself a high upside performance. Again, we have seen guys like Justin Jefferson, 7 catches, 149 and a touchdown. Tyreek Hill, 11 catches, 215 and 2 touchdowns. Davante Adams, 8 catches for 75. We're hoping for CeeDee Lamb to get back on track in the given week. The final of the A tier is Amon-Ra St. Brown. The expectation is that with a limited practice earlier today, he will be able to fully recover and get to a full designated practice by Friday from the abdomen injury and be able to participate up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Again, thus far this season, in weeks 1 through 4, he's been averaging over 14 fantasy points per game, and he's either been able to get himself a receiving touchdown or 100 receiving yards in each of those games. So as long as he's getting one or the other, he obviously has upside in a half PPR scoring format. Now the question is, can this Tampa Bay Buccaneers, defense cover him? The fact of the matter is probably not. They haven't been able to stop many wide receivers, primarily because of the fact that their secondary is being picked on, considering how great their run-stop defense has been this season. As of late, Justin Jefferson, 9 catches, 150. Of course, Jordan Addison in that same game, 4 catches, 61 and a touchdown. DJ Moore, 6 catches, 104. AJ Brown, 9 catches, 131. There is an expectation for Amon-Ra St. Brown to have himself an upside performance within the given week. Just to begin our B tier, we have DJ Moore. Now, DJ Moore, if you just look at the chart on the bottom of the screen, he literally just ran on the sideline for the entirety of the game. And for some reason, the Washington Commanders, using 2 high safeties, didn't think, hey, let's just double cover him the entire game and prevent him from making any receptions. Like I mentioned earlier, DJ Moore was the only wide receiver in that game for the Chicago Bears to have a reception. Darnell Mooney had a couple targets, but didn't even haul in a single one of those. Now, going into the given week, taking on the Minnesota Vikings, there is an expectation for this game to probably be, kind of a little bit of a shootout here, primarily because both these defenses have not played well this season. And if Justin Fields steps up to the task at hand and continues to play as well as he has had 8 passing touchdowns in the last 2 weeks, there is, potential for DJ Moore to once again be in this top 12 conversation at the wide receiver position. In 3 out of the last 4 games, he's either had himself 100 receiving yards minimum or a receiving touchdown minimum. That's fantastic. So the high upside performance is going to be there, especially taking on the 4th easiest matchup at the position, with the Minnesota Vikings allowing over 37 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. I know a lot of people say Justin Fields doesn't play well against good defenses. He hasn't, really had himself a great performance against a good defense. Well, luckily they take on the 1-4 Minnesota Vikings, whose defense has been awful thus far this season. Our number 13 is Mike Evans. Now, earlier today, Mike Evans did not participate in practice, but if in fact Mike Evans, coming off of the bye week, coming off of the hamstring injury that he sustained in week 4 against the New Orleans Saints, if he can get healthy and be able to participate in the upcoming matchup against the Detroit Lions, of course, high upside is on the horizon, primarily because from weeks 1 through 3 prior to the injury, the averages that Mike Evans was putting forth was unbelievable numbers. Career highs. We were seeing him average 9.3 targets, nearly 6 receptions per game, 99 receiving yards per game, 1 receiving touchdown per game on average, 18.73 fantasy points per game. Incredible numbers, especially when we consider the fact that it's not with, a guy like Tom Brady, but rather a guy like Baker Mayfield. Now, the primary reason why I believe the Detroit Lions matchup is an advantageous one, specifically for Mike Evans and or Chris Godwin, is the fact that this defense has been really good in terms of stopping the run. And the Tampa Bay Buccaneers thus far this season with Rachaad White haven't been great in terms of running the ball. Since week 11 of last season, the Detroit Lions have allowed 82 or fewer rushing yards in 12 out of the last 13 games to opposing running backs. Thus far this season, they have not allowed any rushing yards to opposing running backs. Pacheco at 23, Kenneth Walker with 43, Bijan 33, Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon combined for 29. Sanders and Hubbard last week had 67 combined. There isn't much upside in terms of running the ball, so passing will be the only option for this offense. Number 14 is Adam Thielen. Man, Adam Thielen has been playing out of his mind. In the last 3 games with Bryce Young, 16.9 fantasy points, 11.7, and most recently, 22.2 fantasy points, 13 targets, 11 receptions, 107 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown against the Detroit Lions defense. In those last 3 contests, 9, 8, and 13 targets. The opportunity is there, and as the primary number 1 wide receiver, as the security blanket of Bryce Young, and even Andy Dalton in the one game in which they played together against the Seattle Seahawks. Thus far this season, Adam Thielen is top 11 in all 4 primary wide receiver statistics, whether it be targets, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, and honestly, he's a top 12 wide receiver on top of it in a half PPR scoring format. So that's all 5 overall statistics. As he continues to be in this conversation, taking on the Miami Dolphins this upcoming week, there is an expectation that the Miami Dolphins pour on a lot of points very early, and because of that, it will force Bryce Young and the Carolina Panthers to throw for the majority of the second half. Taking on Kader Kohu, the primary nickelback of the Miami Dolphins, it's an advantageous matchup. I'm expecting another big performance out of Adam Thielen. Moving on to our number 15, we have Jordan Addison. Again, in the absence of Justin Jefferson, there is an expectation for even more targets to be sent in the direction of Addison, guys like KJ Osborne, and of course, TJ Hawkinson. Addison's coming off of a week in which he had 9 targets, 6 catches, 64, and a touchdown. And thus far this season, this entire offense just has been pass heavy, and they're not going to stop. That's kind of what their offense is predicated on. Amongst all teams in the National Football League, they have the highest pass rate with a 70.45% pass rate. If you're throwing the ball 70+% of the time, we're expecting Jordan Addison with a vacated target seat of Justin Jefferson, like 10 plus targets every single week usually. If that's available and on the table, Jordan Addison should see himself nearly 10 targets a week. And in the matchup against the Chicago Bears, I'm expecting another big performance, especially considering Jordan Addison thus far this season is putting together a very Calvin Ridley-esque rookie year where he's scoring a bunch of touchdowns. Hopefully he continues that streak. Number 16 is Jakobi Meyers. Jakobi Meyers has been playing incredibly well. In the last 3 games with Jimmy Garoppolo, 24.6, 12.0, 17.0. You have to start him. Jimmy Garoppolo has truly found a little bit of a safety blanket with Jakobi Meyers. I mean, thus far this season, Jakobi Meyers has 3 receiving touchdowns with Jimmy Garoppolo in the 3 games that they have played together. Not 1 each game, but 3 overall, which on average suits pretty well for his overall upside going up against the New England Patriots this upcoming week. Like I mentioned earlier with Davante Adams, there is an expectation considering how many injured prospects the New England Patriots have in their secondary. This is an advantageous matchup going into the given week. On top of the fact that Jimmy Garoppolo and Jakobi Meyers are former members of the New England Patriots, we have a little bit of a revenge game going into the given week. I'm expecting another big game here from Jakobi Meyers. Our number 17 is Gabriel Davis. Man, I mention every single week when people ask, hey, is Gabriel Davis a good start in the given week? And I always respond with, yes, if he scores a touchdown. And luckily for all of our fantasy teams, Gabriel Davis has been on a 4 consecutive game streak of scoring 1 touchdown minimum. The most recent matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars, 6 catches on 8 targets, 100 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. As long as he continues to score touchdowns and he's synonymous with scoring touchdowns, I'll have no complaints. He'll be in my lineup. The only issue that I ever have with Gabriel Davis is the fact that he doesn't see enough of a target share. I mean, 22 targets in the last 4 games on 134 total passing attempts. That's a 16.4% target share within this offense, yet he has 4 receiving touchdowns on 22 targets. Again, the numbers are very sketchy. Nonetheless, they do take on the New York Giants, so the hope is that he'll be able to score early and often within that overall game to be fantasy relevant once again. Our number 18 is Michael Pittman Jr. taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars. Besides the fact that Michael Pittman Jr. in seasons past has had himself a lot of success in the given matchup, earlier on this season in week 1, 11 targets, 8 catches, 97 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown for 19.7 fantasy points with Anthony Richardson. But going into this upcoming weekend's matchup and for the next, probably month and a half ahead, we'll have Gardner Minshew under center for the Indianapolis Colts. In the last 3 games in which Gardner Minshew has either came in because of Anthony Richardson getting injured or, of course, outright been the starter, we have seen Michael Pittman Jr. be targeted 24 times on Gardner Minshew's total 81 passing attempts. That is a 29.63% target share, an unbelievable number. And most recently, we've seen a lot of wide receivers dominate against this Jacksonville Jaguars secondary. Like I mentioned with Gabriel Davis moments ago, 6 catches, 100 yards, and a touchdown. Stefon Diggs last week, 8 catches, 121 and a touchdown. And Tank Dell with 4 catches, 145 and a touchdown. Even Sky Moore had himself 70 yards and a touchdown against this defense. So why not Michael Pittman Jr. with the quarterback still being relevant in Gardner Minshew? Moving on to our D tier, we begin with Jaylen Waddle. Again, Jaylen Waddle is a starting wide receiver. He is a must-start every single week. The only issue that I have going up against the Carolina Panthers is the fact that Jaylen Waddle's overall usage within this offense isn't necessary for them to win these games. And even though Devon Achane is going to be missing due to the fact that he is being put on the injury reserve, Raheem Mostert is probably going to be able to have himself a career day once again, considering it's the second best matchup at the running back position taking on the Carolina Panthers. My primary concern with Jaylen Waddle is once in fact we do see Raheem Mostert and Tyreek Hill have their upside performances both finding the end zone, I'm worried that they may go ahead and just completely blow out the Carolina Panthers. And if that takes place, there may be less upside in the second half for Jaylen Waddle. So he is purely going to have to score early in this game. Otherwise, there may be a conversation in which he doesn't even play in the second half, considering this game can completely get out of hand. We might see Mike White taking center stage under center for the Miami Dolphins in the fourth quarter, considering how bad the Carolina Panthers have played thus far this season. Another concern of mine is the fact that Jaylen Waddle thus far this season, if you compare his average depth of target from 2022 to 2023, he's going from 12.7 to 9.0. The utilization of Jaylen Waddle down the field is not as frequent as it was last season, which is concerning, which means his high overall upside of, huge receptions for a touchdown isn't in the conversation like it was last year. Moving on to our number 20, we have Brandon Aiyuk. They take on the Cleveland Browns. The Cleveland Browns are the toughest matchup at the wide receiver position, having only allowed 14.13 fantasy points per game on average against opposing wide receivers. That being said, the expectation as the number one outside receiver is that he's going to see Denzel Ward for the entirety of the day, if not be double covered for a lot of the overall opportunities that he is given. Brandon Aiyuk is a good wide receiver, but in a difficult matchup, it could be a conversation in which Brandon Aiyuk could get shut down. Considering how many options this offense has and how many mouths they have to feed, I mean, they don't really have to utilize Brandon Aiyuk to find success. Last week, it was a George Kittle, Kyle Juszczyk, Christian McCaffrey day in which each of them scored at least one touchdown. Deebo Samuel, Brandon Aiyuk, kind of left out to the wayside. So if in fact we're going to get into a conversation once again in which the Cleveland Browns defense locks down Brandon Aiyuk, that could be a little concerning. Otherwise, he's the deep receiving threat of this offense and is going to have himself a couple opportunities just like he did last week. It's just a matter of can he go ahead and develop a huge reception off those overall opportunities and make some plays after the catch. Now, before we get into the second half of the wide receiver conversation, a reminder, if you guys haven't checked out the 1.01 brand, the official merchandise line of the Andrew Kirchhoff YouTube channel, be sure to check it out today at andrewkirchhoffshop.com. Link down in the description. Find yourself high quality, comfortable, and stylish clothing for your upcoming stressful fantasy football Sundays, where I'm repping, of course, greetings and salutations and the 1.01 brand and supporting the channel. Again, at this current moment in time, thanks to all of you guys' incredible support, shipping is free, so take advantage of the opportunity of repping the brand for this upcoming season. Thank you very much. All right. Let's get into the second half of the conversation, beginning with Chris Olave. He's coming off of a week in which, prior to the game, during warmups, injured his ankle. Luckily, he was still able to play in that game. Luckily, he was able to get himself a receiving touchdown to save his week. But nonetheless, there is some concern that he may still not be fully healthy. He was already limited in today's practice, so he is already within the questionable tag going into this upcoming weekend. But taking on the Houston Texans, again, it's not an easy matchup. And on top of it, if we're going to be in a conversation in which Chris Olave is going to be hobbled or injured in any sort of capacity, we can't purely trust him. That being said, Chris Olave did play the most snaps amongst all wide receivers in that game last week against the New England Patriots. So even with the injury that he sustained prior to the game, he still played the most snaps amongst all wide receivers and still got himself a decent amount of fantasy points. We would have loved to have seen far more, but 5 total targets, 2 receptions is not going to cut it. We need far more upside, and the difficult matchup may not lend to that in the given week. Moving on to our number 22, we have DK Metcalf. Thus far this season, in every single game, DK Metcalf has put up 10 or more fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. They take on the Cincinnati Bengals in the given week. Chidobe Awuzie, their primary number one cornerback, did not participate in the game last week against the Arizona Cardinals. So if their number one cornerback is out and already did not practice earlier today and is going to be out for another consecutive week, this is only going to lead to more upside for someone like DK Metcalf. There's a reason why Hollywood Brown against the Cincinnati Bengals defense was able to have himself another big day. And there's an expectation for DK Metcalf with a healthy Geno Smith coming off of the bye week to have himself a big game within the given week against Cincinnati. Could be a shootout considering how great these two offenses have played thus far this season. Moving on to our number 23, we have DeVonta Smith. Now, like I mentioned earlier with AJ Brown, we have seen in weeks this season, considering the Eagles offense hasn't been as efficient as they were last year, some of the receiving threats kind of disappear, whether it's Dallas Goedert, early in the season, weeks 1 and 2, it was AJ Brown. And most recently, in the last couple games, it's been DeVonta Smith, unfortunately. 1 catch for 6 receiving yards this last week in a matchup in which we anticipated him to get far more utilization, but unfortunately, the 5 targets were not enough. Now, DeVonta Smith is not a receiver that is going to have a tantrum on the sideline and force them to give him the ball. But what we have seen from the Philadelphia Eagles and Nick Sirianni, anytime one of the receiving options of this offense goes underutilized within a given week, whether it is AJ Brown or Dallas Goedert, the following week, we have a big upside performance. So the hope is that DeVonta Smith can get back on track, taking on the New York Jets. Most recently, the New York Jets have given up 10 catches, 102 and a touchdown to Stefon Diggs, 11 catches for 143 to CeeDee Lamb. So why not someone like DeVonta Smith in the given week? I know that already thus far this season, 3 of his 5 games have consisted of 5 targets only. And when you go back to 2022, 12 of his 17 overall games consisted of 8 or more targets. Hopefully, we're going to get back on track for DeVonta Smith, get him far more target utilization. And when they do, of course, high upside fantasy performances will be on the horizon. Moving on to our number 24, we have Deebo Samuel. The only thing that concerns me about Deebo Samuel is the fact that he doesn't get a lot of overall targets every single week. And he really does need a touchdown to find himself overall upside. He had himself a 10-point fantasy week, but primarily because he had himself 5 overall rushing attempts for 30 rushing yards. Now, all those attempts are not out of the backfield. A lot of those are screen passes that are kind of laterals, that are kind of considered rushing attempts, but ultimately are passes on swing kind of screens, etc. Nonetheless, going forward in the matchup, like I mentioned earlier with Brandon Aiyuk, it is the most difficult matchup at the wide receiver position. They're allowing less than 15 fantasy points per game and a half PPR to opposing wide receivers, and considering how many threats this offense has with McCaffrey, with Kittle, with Aiyuk, it does not bode well for Deebo Samuel to have himself consistent production and consistently score touchdowns despite how great this offense has been. Moving on to our number 25, we have Marquise Brown. Marquise Brown has been incredible this season. In each of the last 4 games, has had a base minimum of 13 fantasy points and a half PPR scoring format. In 3 out of the last 4 games, he has had 10 or more overall targets. That opportunity, the fantasy upside, it's all there. They take on the Los Angeles Rams, and we've seen other wide receivers put together great performances. Early in the season, DK Metcalf, 3 catches, 47 and a touchdown. Deebo Samuel, 101 total yards and a touchdown. Jamar Chase, 12 catches for 141. And of course, A.J. Brown, most recently this last week, 6 catches for 127. There is an expectation that Marquise Brown could have himself another upside week. Last season, against this defense, 14 catches for 140 receiving yards and 21 fantasy points. We're hoping for an upside game, but understand there have been other wide receivers within this matchup that have been shut down. DeVonta Smith, Michael Pittman Jr., Tyler Lockett, Brandon Aiyuk, they've disappeared in these matchups. We're hoping that won't be the case for Marquise Brown. Number 26 is DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins, man, finally, we have seen him get another week of 10 plus targets. This is the first time since week 1. And luckily, he was taking on a matchup against the Indianapolis Colts, which obviously was an advantageous matchup. Now, going into the given week against the Baltimore Ravens, even though in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers, it hasn't been, one of the greatest matchups. We've seen wide receivers absolutely ball out against this defense. Most recently, we have seen George Pickens, 6 catches, 130 and a touchdown. Michael Pittman Jr., 9 catches for 77. T. Higgins earlier in the season, 8 catches, 89, and 2 touchdowns. There is a potential for DeAndre Hopkins to have himself another big game here. He, amongst all wide receivers, has the most targets without a receiving touchdown thus far this season. 42 targets, 0 receiving touchdowns. Hopefully, this week will be the change. And even with Marlon Humphrey returning to the Baltimore Ravens starting defense, it didn't matter. George Pickens tore him apart regardless. So DeAndre Hopkins should be on hand for another big performance here. Our number 27 is Christian Kirk. My only concern with Christian Kirk is the fact that he plays against the Indianapolis Colts. And earlier this season, week 1, had himself quite literally 1.4 fantasy points, 3 targets, 1 reception, 9 receiving yards, and wasn't a huge part of the offense within the given game. You even go back to 2022 against the Indianapolis Colts. In those games, 6 targets and 5 targets, 22.8 fantasy points, 8.8 fantasy points, primarily because he scored 3 touchdowns in those 2 games and was able to save his weeks. If he doesn't score a touchdown in the given week, taking on Kenny Moore has really been a difficulty of Christian Kirk in his career thus far with the Jacksonville Jaguars. With that being the case, I am concerned about it. So going into the upcoming matchup, especially if in fact Zay Jones is to return, there could be less upside for Christian Kirk within the matchup. Moving on to Tyler Lockett, our number 28. Tyler Lockett has been relatively quiet thus far this season. Outside of the singular game in which he had 2 touchdowns, hasn't been a reliable fantasy prospect. Now, they are coming off of a bye week. We should have a healthy Geno Smith on hand, and they do take on the Cincinnati Bengals. Hopefully, we can see a shootout similar to the way that the Seattle Seahawks played against the Detroit Lions earlier this season, especially with Chidobe Awuzie most likely going to miss another consecutive week. That'll mean that the number 2 cornerback will cover a guy like DK Metcalf, and the number 3 cornerback that typically isn't the starter or is the nickelback that is being moved to the outside corner position will be covering Tyler Lockett, which will make it that much more of an advantageous matchup. We're hoping for kind of a resurgence from this offense, specifically from Tyler Lockett. Moving on to our number 29, we have Chris Godwin. Like I mentioned earlier, there is a potential in which Mike Evans doesn't play this week. If Mike Evans does not play, I think Chris Godwin, without a doubt in my mind, is a top 15 option, primarily because we just saw Adam Thielen in the slot position tear apart this defense. Last week, 13 targets, 11 receptions, 107 receiving yards, and a touchdown for over 20 fantasy points. And that's primarily where, Chris Godwin has found a lot of success. Now, even though they're utilizing him on the outside more this season than in seasons past, there is an expectation that if in fact Mike Evans is limited or not even present within the game, there's going to be far more targets going in the direction of Chris Godwin, especially considering you go back to week 4. In that game, Mike Evans leaves with a hamstring injury. Chris Godwin, 11 targets, 8 catches, 114. The best performance of his season, the most targets that he has seen, mainly because Evans wasn't on the field garnering all of the targets. So if that's going to be the case, of course, Godwin has himself a lot of potential within the given week. Number 30 is Drake London. Again, Drake London takes on the Washington Commanders. The Washington Commanders have been destroyed by wide receivers over the top of their defense for the entirety of the season, to be totally honest. I mean, you even go back to Marvin Mims, 2 catches for 113 and a touchdown. Stefon Diggs, 8 catches for 111. AJ Brown, 9 catches, 175, 2 touchdowns. DJ Moore, 8 catches, 230 and 2 touchdowns. I mean, this defense even had to replace their starting rookie cornerback middle of the game against DJ Moore, and they had to move Benjamin St-Juste against DJ Moore, and he even couldn't stop him throughout the entirety of that game. I mean, the Washington Commanders defense is a mess, and the fact that the Atlanta Falcons play at home, Desmond Ridder plays far better at home. He's undefeated throughout his entire career at home. In the last 2 games, has been balling out at home. There is an expectation that Drake London could have himself a big performance in the given week as our number 30. Number 31 is Zay Flowers. Look at the routes that he is running down the field. I mean, considering the fact that Odell Beckham Jr. has been dealing with injuries, they have Nelson Aguilar, who's dropping touchdowns, Rashad Bateman, who's dropping touchdowns. So Zay Flowers continues to be one of these primary targets. I mean, thus far this season, 3 of his 5 games has been double-digit targets. And amongst all wide receiver options with 40 or more targets, only him and, of course, DeAndre Hopkins are the only wide receivers that don't have a receiving touchdown yet. Hopefully, Zay Flowers can get on the board, finally score his first receiving touchdown of his career. They do take on the Tennessee Titans. They've got a great run-stopping defense, and if that forces Lamar Jackson to pass the ball for majority of the game, we're hoping for Zay Flowers to potentially find the end zone to hopefully take his overall performance to the next level. Moving on to our number 32, we have T. Higgins. Again, like I mentioned earlier with Jamar Chase, T. Higgins has been dealing with a rib fracture. He is attempting to practice in the given week, and if there is an expectation for him to play in the given weekend's game against the Seattle Seahawks, again, the Seattle Seahawks are the second best matchup at the position, and Joe Burrow's recovery is trending in the right direction as he's looked very healthy. I mean, he was even scrambling for a first down last week, running out of the pocket. So if T. Higgins can get back into this lineup, he'll go back to being a high-end wide receiver 2 option, but we don't know what his injury status is, whether he'll be limited in the game, whether he'll even play. Therefore, I have him at number 32 as a overall kind of speculation as to whether or not he has the ability to even play in the given week. We'll have to keep that monitored by the time we get to Sunday. Moving on to our number 33, we have Garrett Wilson. They do take on the Philadelphia Eagles. It is going to be a negative game script for the entirety of the game. And because of that being the case, a lot of wide receivers have dominated against the Philadelphia Eagles secondary this season because of those negative game scripts. I mean, most recently, Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp dominated. Cooper Kupp, 8 catches, 118. Puka, 7 catches, 71 and a touchdown. Justin Jefferson, 11 for 159. Kendrick Bourne, 6 catches, 62 and 2 touchdowns. Terry McLaurin, 8 catches for 86, jumped on a touchdown in that game off of a fumble. Mike Evans, 5 for 60 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown. Everyone plays well against the Philadelphia Eagles. Hopefully, Garrett Wilson will have the quarterback play at a little bit of a higher level, and Zach Wilson can at least help him be fantasy relevant within the given week. Moving on to our number 34, Nico Collins. The issue that I have with Nico Collins primarily has to do with the fact that he has a very difficult matchup taking on Marshawn Lattimore within the given week. We are anticipating that the Houston Texans will be throwing for majority of this game, primarily because the New Orleans Saints are the second most difficult matchup in terms of running the ball for running backs thus far this season in terms of fantasy points per game on average. So with that overall difficulty, the expectation is a lot of throwing attempts from a guy like CJ Stroud. And whether it goes in the direction of Nico Collins is not, a guarantee, primarily because even last week he got shut down by AJ Terrell. Taking on Marshawn Lattimore this week isn't an easy matchup. Could be difficult for him, and it could be a Tank Dell week, to say the very least, if in fact Tank Dell clears concussion protocol. Moving on to our number 35, we have Amari Cooper. We don't even know if Deshaun Watson is going to play. Again, a lot of these players overall are speculatory, mainly because they're either dealing with an injury or somebody else associated with that offense is dealing with an injury. Deshaun Watson missed week 4's overall game. He hit the bye week. He's returned from the bye week and didn't even practice. They've signed PJ Walker to be this backup quarterback because there is an assumption that potentially Deshaun Watson misses another consecutive week taking on the San Francisco 49ers. Even though we have seen Amari Cooper last season play very well with Jakobi Brissett, they had a report from the offseason. I don't think that PJ Walker can just jump in, go up against the San Francisco 49ers with Amari Cooper and allow Amari Cooper to, be anything better than a lower end wide receiver 3 unless he scores a big touchdown, which is, potentially in the realm of possibility, but tough to potentially trust within the given week. Moving on to our number 36, Josh Reynolds. Josh Reynolds in the last 5 games, 10.0 fantasy points, 21.1, 0, 8.4, and 15.6. He's been relatively consistent and a guy that I can trust as my wide receiver 3 in a deeper league. If I can start 3 wide receivers within a given week and also have an additional flex, I think Josh Reynolds as the wide receiver 3 is quite a complimentary option, especially considering the fact that this offense is dealing with Amon-Ra St. Brown's abdomen injury. Jamison Williams is still working it within the offense. The fact that they take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, it is going to be a little bit more difficult to run the ball against that defense. But ultimately, if Josh Reynolds on the outside continues to play, the majority of the snaps of the wide receiver position, gets majority of the targets, considering him and Goff's overall rapport, whether it's back in the days of the Rams or, of course, now with the Detroit Lions. Josh Reynolds, a solid play as our number 36. Number 37 is Jerry Jeudy. Jerry Jeudy last season in the 2 matchups against the Kansas City Chiefs. Week 14, 8 catches, 73, 3 touchdowns, 29.3 fantasy points. The best game of his entire career. In Week 17 matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs, 7 catches, 38, 7.3 fantasy points. There is a potential in which Jerry Jeudy could be relevant within the given week, coming off of a week in which he had the most targets and receptions amongst all Denver Broncos wide receivers against the Jets defense. Only 6 catches for 50 yards, but if he can continue to be the number 1 receiving option of this offense in a game in which it'll be a negative game script, throwing for majority of the second half, Russell Wilson can hopefully find him with a consistent volume of targets that could lead to his fantasy relevancy. Moving on, we have our number 38 and one of the top overall waiver wire options in the given week, KJ Osborne. I honestly believe that KJ Osborne should be able to surpass, wide receiver 38. That should be an easy accomplishment, especially considering, like I mentioned earlier with Jordan Addison, amongst all teams in the National Football League, the Minnesota Vikings have the highest passing rate, over 70%. Amongst all teams, this is the team that is throwing the most. And if they're going to continue to do so in the absence of Justin Jefferson, expect a lot of targets going in the direction of KJ Osborne. If you go back to 2021, in the span of time in which we saw Adam Thielen miss a lot of the back end of the season, in the 4 games in which Adam Thielen was missing, we saw KJ Osborne average 7 targets, 4 receptions, 62 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown per game, and over 14 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time. We have seen him be a relevant fantasy receiving option, especially with Kirk Cousins. In the absence of Justin Jefferson, I don't expect him to be the number 1 or number 2 receiving option, but as the number 3 receiving option of this offense, again, complementary to Addison and TJ Hawkinson, he could find himself in the end zone like he has multiple times already this season. Moving on to our number 39, speaking of finding the end zone, in each of the last 2 games, Curtis Samuel has found the end zone. He takes on the Atlanta Falcons this upcoming week, and the Falcons have a weakness. Their weakness is against slot receiving options. Thus far this season, Jaden Reed, 4 catches, 37, 2 receiving touchdowns. Amon-Ra St. Brown, 9 catches, 102. Christian Kirk, 8 catches, 84. Slot receiving options have dominated against this defense. I'm expecting Curtis Samuel to be the leading receiving option of the Washington Commanders going up against the Atlanta Falcons in the given week. Our number 40 to close out today's episode is Michael Thomas. Michael Thomas has been consistent. Over the course of the season, thus far in a half PPR scoring format, 7 to 9 fantasy points every single week. Throughout that, overall range, obviously we want him to go ahead and score a touchdown and get to that double-digit number. But considering the consistency that he has demonstrated thus far this season, I think he deserves to be ranked going up against the Houston Texans in a game in which Chris Olave could truly be shut down if, in fact, that ankle injury is going to continue to bother him. It's just a matter of, can Derek Carr continue to get, progressively healthier and get that shoulder on the right track so that we can push the ball down the field. As you can see from the next-gen stats overall routes that Michael Thomas ran in Week 5, again, he was pushing the ball down the field. Unfortunately, a lot of those overall passes were incompletions. If, in fact, Derek Carr can just get a little bit healthier, we're going to see a lot more upside for Michael Thomas in the coming weeks. All right, that's going to cover it for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you have not yet already, click the like button, subscribe to the channel, comment down below. Tomorrow, we'll be talking about quarterback and tight end rankings prior to the Thursday night football game between the Kansas City Chiefs and, of course, the Denver Broncos. Like I mentioned earlier, be sure to use code Andrew via Underdog Fantasy. Again, if you want to go ahead and get my rankings for the remainder of the season, all you got to do is use code Andrew, make a first-time deposit minimum of $10. Of course, you'll be able to take advantage of that opportunity, get to play the Pick'ems game, put together a Pick'em slip for tomorrow's game between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Denver Broncos, picking higher than 0.5 total yards for Patrick Mahomes, accompanying him with another player. You go ahead and get that correctly, instantly in the money. So check that out today, and until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.